Arrogant boss publicly humiliates a struggling worker, but when karma hits, he loses everything. Before we dive into this insane story, tell us in the comments, have you ever had a terrible boss? And if you love justice stories like this, hit that subscribe button because we post at the same time every day. Ethan wiped his brow, suppressing a weary sigh as he glanced up at the clock on the wall. He had clocked out of his shift an hour ago, but here he was, back on the dusty tile floor of the stockroom, rearranging crates under the flickering fluorescent light. Normally, Ethan would have headed home by now, especially since rent was due soon, and he had already worked a grueling double shift. But his manager, Grayson, had ordered him to stay behind. The moment Grayson had barked that command, pointing to the spare crates like Ethan was a servant rather than an employee, a knot of anxiety took hold in Ethan's stomach. Something about the man's tone felt different tonight. It wasn't just the usual bluster or dismissiveness. There was cruelty in his voice. Ethan had tried to explain he was off the clock, but Grayson simply sneered and said, "You're a real piece of work, aren't you? If you need money that bad, you'll do what I say." That was the first red flag, the moment that told Ethan he was in for a long, humiliating night. He pressed his lips together, forced a polite nod, and continued stacking boxes, all the while feeling the weight of that condescending remark. The store around him was nearly empty. Only a few employees left because the place was closing soon. Their footsteps echoed quietly as they tried to finish their own tasks, but no one dared look directly at Ethan. Everyone knew Grayson's wrath was something you avoided at all costs. That was the power he held. This manager could schedule more hours for you if he liked you, or cut them in half on a whim if he didn't. And Ethan needed as many hours as he could get. The problem was, Grayson liked to make it personal. He seemed to have a radar for anyone who was struggling, and made it a point to squeeze them until they begged for mercy. He'd use phrases like, "You should be grateful for the chance to work here," and "I can replace you in a heartbeat." More than once, he had humiliated Ethan publicly, calling him out over the store's intercom to pick up the pace if Ethan ever took too long helping a customer. Grayson didn't care that Ethan was known for being polite, patient, and thorough. He just saw it as slow. And if Ethan wasn't hustling at a pace Grayson deemed acceptable, he'd make sure everyone within earshot knew about it. It didn't matter that Ethan had perfect attendance or that he was regularly complimented by customers. None of that held any weight once Grayson decided you were a target. It was demoralizing, especially on nights like this when Ethan wanted nothing more than to head home, eat some leftovers, and get a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. He kept working despite the throbbing ache in his lower back. Ever since he had picked up a second part-time job to make ends meet, rest had become an elusive luxury. This was the fourth night in a row he'd stayed late without pay, forced to do menial tasks that weren't even part of his official job description. But Ethan needed the money, every last dollar. He couldn't risk losing the job entirely. If Grayson let him go, Ethan's landlord would have him out on the street within a month. The thought of eviction, of not being able to cover his basic needs, hung over him like a storm cloud. So he would grit his teeth, apologize for complaining, and hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the last time Grayson made such unreasonable demands. Grayson appeared around the corner, arms folded, a smug grin plastered on his face. "You think you're done?" he asked with a mocking chuckle. Ethan flinched at the sudden voice behind him, but turned around calmly, trying not to show any irritation. "I've just got these last few crates to stack," he said. "I should be out of here soon." But that smug grin didn't leave Grayson's face. "You'll be out of here when I say you're out of here," he snapped. "You got a problem with that?" It wasn't a question meant to be answered. The manager was all too aware of Ethan's precarious position and was taking full advantage. The tension in the small room thickened, and for a split second, Ethan considered just walking away. He imagined himself grabbing his jacket, saying, "I quit," and marching out the door with a small sense of dignity. But the reality was, if he did that, he'd have no job to come back to in the morning. That fantasy shattered quickly, replaced by the suffocating truth. He had to do what Grayson said, or risk losing everything. As Ethan resumed stacking, he could almost feel the manager's eyes burning into him, waiting for a misstep or a hint of defiance. It took every ounce of willpower to keep his head down. Across the store, other employees would occasionally poke their heads around corners, as if checking to see if Grayson was still looming over Ethan like a hawk. None of them dared to intervene, not even the shift supervisor, who technically outranked. Grayson, in some capacity, seemed brave enough to confront him. The power dynamic was clear. Grayson was the self-appointed king, and he ruled with intimidation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grayson let out a loud sigh. "All right, get out of here," he snapped. "I've had enough of looking at your face tonight." Ethan didn't need a second invitation. He practically rushed toward the employee lockers, grabbed his jacket, and clocked out. His whole body shook with a mixture of anger and relief. But there was a sense of dread too, because he knew it wasn't over. This wasn't some one-time outburst. Grayson's hostility had been growing, and Ethan sensed it would only get worse. He left the store that night feeling drained, but he had no idea just how intense this battle would become. Tomorrow would bring its own share of chaos, humiliation, and, ultimately, a spark of courage he never knew he had. The next morning, Ethan woke up with heavy eyes and a nagging headache. He'd tossed and turned all night, replaying the scene at the stockroom in his mind. He tried to push it aside because he had another shift in just a few hours. As he made coffee in his cramped apartment, the single-burner stove hissed and clicked, proof that the landlord still hadn't fixed it properly. He took a shaky sip and forced himself to eat a slice of stale bread for breakfast, hoping the caffeine would jolt him awake. His phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa, a co-worker he trusted. "You okay?" it read simply. Ethan typed back, "Not really, but I'll manage. See you at work." Then he trudged out the door, heading for the bus stop. The ride to the store was short, but it felt like an eternity. He looked out the window, watching people hustle along the sidewalks, each with their own problems. He couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Every time the bus lurched forward, his nerves twitched. By the time he arrived, the sun was fully up, the parking lot half filled with employees' cars and early shoppers. He tugged the store's glass door open, dreading the possibility of seeing Grayson's face right away. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed overhead, and the faint odor of cleaning supplies clung to the air. His stomach felt like a knot. At first, the shift seemed normal enough. He clocked in, grabbed his assigned tasks, and began organizing inventory on the floor. Customers trickled in, and he greeted them with a polite smile. That was something Ethan was known for. He could always make a shopper feel welcome, even if he was fighting his own internal battles. The hours ticked by slowly, but there was no sign of Grayson. A flicker of hope told him maybe the manager wouldn't show up today. Maybe he had a day off. But just as that thought crossed his mind, he glanced over to see the man himself strolling in through the main entrance, leaning over the customer service counter to flirt with a new hire. She looked uncomfortable, but he kept going, leaning closer, saying something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan's heart sank. He forced himself to keep folding sweaters on the display rack, acting as though he hadn't noticed Grayson. The manager eventually wandered deeper into the store, smirking in Ethan's direction before disappearing behind a row of shelves. The tension was back, swirling around Ethan like a storm cloud. He found himself struggling to focus on even the simplest tasks, constantly wondering when Grayson would pop out of an aisle to criticize him again. An hour later, the first red flag of the day took shape in a disturbing scene. A co-worker, Martin, was on the verge of tears near the exit doors, his voice trembling as he spoke to Grayson. "I'm sorry," Martin said. "I just need to leave an hour early. My kid got sick at school." Grayson's reply was a loud, mocking laugh that echoed across the store. A few customers turned to stare. "You think I care about your problems?" Grayson sneered. "If you leave now, don't bother coming back. I run a business, not a daycare." The look on Martin's face was heartbreaking. He was torn between his job and his child. Ethan watched from a distance, every instinct telling him to step in, but fear held him back. He knew if he intervened, he might get the same treatment or worse. Grayson looked around as if daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. Martin swallowed hard and muttered something about seeing if another co-worker could cover him. Grayson just shrugged and walked away, making it clear he didn't care. Ethan felt a surge of anger welling up inside him. This was beyond unprofessional. It was cruel. But the rest of the shift carried on, tense and miserable. Whenever Grayson walked by, he'd leave some snide remark or bark an order at Ethan, Lisa, or any other unfortunate soul he decided was slacking off. The air felt thick with unspoken resentment. Customers noticed the tension, eyeing the employees with pity or awkward curiosity. Ethan found Lisa in the break room later, her eyes red from what looked like crying. She'd just had a run-in with Grayson as well, something about her schedule. He said she wasn't committed enough and threatened to cut her hours if she didn't pick up more weekend shifts. Lisa needed those shifts, but she also had a second job that helped pay for her online courses. Grayson didn't care. He wanted absolute loyalty, or as he called it, proper work ethic. It was vile and manipulative, and everyone was starting to see the pattern. Grayson wasn't just a harsh boss. He was a bully who thrived on making people feel helpless. By the end of the day, Ethan felt drained again, and he still had hours left on his shift. Everywhere he looked, morale was rock bottom. While customers hustled in and out, oblivious to the internal misery, employees exchanged grim looks, bracing themselves for the next round of insults or impossible demands. Ethan couldn't help but notice the subtle ways people tried to avoid. Grayson, ducking behind shelves, taking longer routes to the stockroom, anything to escape his line of sight. But Grayson always found someone to pick on, like a lion hunting for stragglers in a herd. Ethan clenched his jaw as he stalked the last of the day's new arrivals. The resentment burning inside him felt ready to boil over. He knew something had to give, or this hostile atmosphere would destroy all of them. Still, fear lingered, holding him back from outright confrontation. Grayson was cunning, and Ethan couldn't risk losing his livelihood. But as he glanced at Martin's hunched shoulders and Lisa's puffy eyes, he felt a spark of determination. Maybe it was time someone did something about this, even if it was risky. Ethan locked up his locker at the end of the night, shoulders stiff from carrying heavy boxes all evening. On his way out, he found a small cluster of employees, including Lisa and Martin, whispering in the dimly lit parking lot. They were talking about Grayson, venting their frustrations, shaking their heads with resignation. "He cut my hours again," Martin said, kicking at a loose pebble. "Can't afford to lose them, but he said if I cross him one more time, he'll fire me. The man practically threatened my entire livelihood over a family emergency." Lisa nodded in empathy and then turned her gaze to Ethan. "You too. I saw the way he was after you last night." Ethan sighed and admitted that Grayson had kept him an extra hour off the clock. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent parking lot lights. After a moment, Lisa cleared her throat. "We need to do something," she said firmly. "This can't go on." Some nodded in agreement, others looked too terrified to speak up. One co-worker mumbled about contacting HR, but then immediately doubted that corporate would do anything. "They only care about results," he said, "and Grayson is a master at faking good numbers." Indeed, Grayson's department often topped sales charts, but at the expense of the employees' well-being. Overworked, underpaid, and constantly berated, the staff lived in perpetual dread of losing their jobs. Ethan felt the knot in his stomach tighten further. He wanted to speak up, but he felt powerless. That was exactly how Grayson liked it. Returning home that night, he collapsed onto his couch, mind reeling with possible solutions. Contacting corporate directly, quitting and finding another job, filing a complaint with some labor board. All of it sounded either too risky or too time-consuming, and he needed a paycheck now. But he couldn't just ignore the injustice. Grayson was systematically destroying people's confidence and livelihoods, relishing every moment of it. The next day, Ethan managed to arrive a bit early. He wanted to check something. He'd heard rumors about employees not getting their full paychecks, that Grayson might be tampering with timesheets. Ethan had never thought to double-check his own pay stub. but now that suspicion gnawed at him. In the break room, he quietly opened the company's payroll portal on his phone. Sure enough, his last paycheck was missing nearly 3 hours of clocked time. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the records. It was blatantly incorrect. Furious, he confronted the shift supervisor, who looked uneasy. "I can't do anything about payroll," the supervisor said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting Grayson to appear any second. "You need to speak with him." Ethan stood there, stunned. The irony of it all. He had to speak to the very person who might be stealing from him. But he couldn't let it go. That money was crucial to his rent. Steeling himself, Ethan walked onto the sales floor and found Grayson standing near the electronics section, leaning against a display rack. The manager was scrolling on his phone, looking bored. "Hey, Grayson," Ethan began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just noticed an issue with my paycheck." The manager glanced up, raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, and what's that?" Ethan held his phone forward, the payroll numbers visible. "I'm missing 3 hours. I have the timesheets to prove I was clocked in." For a moment, Grayson's expression flickered, some quick calculation behind his eyes. Then he shrugged. "That's weird," he said, not sounding the least bit concerned. "Maybe you forgot to clock in or something." Ethan's voice tightened. "I definitely clocked in. I checked." Grayson smirked and shook his head. "Look, I don't handle payroll personally. Maybe you should talk to the shift supervisor." The very supervisor who had just sent Ethan to Grayson. It was a trap, a runaround. Ethan realized Grayson might be counting on him to get frustrated and drop it. The audacity of that smug grin made Ethan's blood boil. But he kept his composure, forced a polite smile. "Well, I want to make sure it's noted, so I'm putting it in writing. I'd appreciate if you passed it along to whoever handles this." Grayson rolled his eyes, snatched Ethan's phone, and pretended to read something. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll pass it on." Then he practically tossed the phone back at Ethan and walked away, as though Ethan's complaint was an irritating fly buzzing in his ear. Ethan took a shaky breath. He knew that "I'll pass it on" meant nothing. This man wasn't going to help. But maybe the confrontation let Grayson know that Ethan was paying attention. That thought alone gave Ethan a tiny spark of satisfaction. If nothing else, he was done being a doormat. For the rest of the day, he kept a record of every minute he worked. He made sure to take screenshots of his clock-in and clock-out times. It felt sneaky, but it was necessary. If Grayson wanted to keep playing dirty, Ethan would have evidence. He didn't want to confront him directly without proof, but it was looking more and more like that might be his only option. By the time Ethan's lunch break came around, he was mentally exhausted. He found Lisa near the vending machines, eyes scanning her own pay stub. She looked up, shook her head. "I'm missing 2 hours," she whispered, biting her lip. "I can't believe he'd stoop this low." The revelation made Ethan's stomach twist. If Lisa was missing time, how many others had lost wages without even realizing it? And how much money had Grayson taken collectively, either through malicious intent or by convenient errors that he never bothered to correct? This was more than just a toxic work environment. It was outright theft. A determination settled in Ethan's mind as he finished his microwaved meal. Something was rotten in the store, and Grayson was at the center of it. Ethan quietly resolved that he'd do more than just keep records. He'd find a way to expose Grayson if it came down to it. The fear still lingered, but a sense of righteousness started to overshadow it. There was a hidden conflict here, and it wasn't just about one bad boss. It was about standing up for everyone who couldn't risk losing what little they had. And that night, as Ethan left the store, he felt a sliver of hope flicker. Maybe, just maybe, Grayson wasn't invincible after all. The following week was tense. Every shift, Ethan showed up with a growing sense of dread, wondering what Grayson would do next. He kept his phone handy, making sure to document any shady conversations or odd directives from the manager. Lisa did the same, and they quietly encouraged Martin and a few others to keep track of their hours. People started whispering in corners, sharing stories of missing pay or sudden unexplained schedule changes. It was like a secret network forming to gather evidence. Quiet unity bred cautious optimism, but also deep fear. After all, if Grayson caught wind of their plan, he might retaliate in a way that would leave them all jobless. Meanwhile, Grayson continued to strut around the store like an emperor, berating employees at will. He made sly, condescending comments about the slow ones and the whiners, which everyone knew was code for Ethan and Lisa. He even sent Martin home early one day, effectively cutting his hours because Martin didn't look motivated enough. Martin needed those hours more than ever because his child's medical bills were piling up. Every time Grayson flaunted his power, the staff felt the weight of despair. Yet, a simmering anger also grew among them. One afternoon, Grayson cornered Ethan in the back aisle, away from any customers who might overhear. "You've been real chatty with the team lately," he said, eyes narrowing, "spreading rumors about paychecks and timesheets. Careful, or I'll make sure you never see another dime from this place." Ethan's heart pounded, but he feigned ignorance. "I'm just talking to people on my break, Grayson. Nothing wrong with that." Grayson stepped closer, the sour smell of his cologne filling Ethan's nostrils. "Watch yourself," he hissed, jabbing a finger into Ethan's chest. "Keep stirring up trouble, and you'll be out the door." Then, just as quickly, he stepped back, plastering on a fake smile, because a customer was wandering into view. The manager greeted them cheerily, switching to a warm tone that left Ethan feeling sick with disgust. That encounter lit a fire under Ethan. He realized they had to move faster. The group needed solid proof if they were going to take this higher. Lisa, who had once been timid, showed Ethan her phone's voice recorder app. "Next time he threatens me," she whispered, "I'm hitting record." Ethan nodded, agreeing that they'd do whatever it took to protect themselves and bring Grayson down. Secretly, Ethan had already started recording some of his interactions, though he hadn't gotten anything as explicit as direct wage theft admissions, just Grayson's bullying tone, which might help paint a picture of a hostile work environment. But they needed more, something indisputable. Things reached a boiling point when a younger employee, Jade, stepped into the break room crying. She was only 18, working part-time to save up for college. According to her, Grayson had scolded her for asking about her schedule and threatened to schedule her for every weekend until she quit. "He told me I should drop out of my classes if I wanted to keep a job," Jade sobbed. Who says that to someone? The cruelty was blatant, and it was all the more reason for Ethan to act. He put a comforting hand on Jade's shoulder and exchanged a meaningful look with Lisa and Martin. They knew what had to be done. The next day, Ethan decided to test the waters more aggressively. He carefully approached Grayson in the main aisle, where the cameras couldn't record their conversation as clearly, but where customers might overhear if they paid attention. "Hey Grayson," Ethan started. "About those missing hours, I still haven't seen them corrected on my new paycheck." The manager's jaw tightened and he forced a smile. "Not my problem," he said through clenched teeth. Ethan pressed on. "Look, I know corporate's policy. They require that all timesheet discrepancies be addressed within one pay cycle, so either you fix this or I contact them directly." Grayson's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice level, aware there were a few customers browsing nearby. "You don't want to do that, Ethan," he warned softly. "Trust me, you don't." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why not? You said it's not your problem, so maybe corporate can help me." The tension was palpable, and a couple of customers glanced over, but Grayson just inhaled sharply, gave a forced laugh, and responded loudly enough for the onlookers to hear. "Oh, Ethan, you must be mistaken. Of course we'll fix your hours. There's no need to involve corporate." Ethan nodded, playing along, and walked away. But inside, his heart pounded like a drum. He had just challenged Grayson in public. That meant the manager's wrath would come swift and hard the moment the customers weren't around. Sure enough, as soon as Ethan turned the corner, he heard Grayson's voice behind him, hissing like a snake. "You're done for!" Ethan pretended not to hear. His hands trembled slightly, but he felt strangely empowered. He'd stood up for himself, even if it was risky. The rest of the day was a precarious dance of avoidance. Grayson prowling around, searching for any excuse to corner Ethan, while Ethan stuck to busier areas of the store. By closing time, Ethan's nerves were shot. He felt the same from Lisa, Martin, and Jade, who looked over their shoulders constantly. Everyone knew the confrontation was inevitable. Grayson was the type to never let a perceived slight go unpunished. And sure enough, as the store lights dimmed and the last customer walked out, Grayson singled out Ethan, forcing him to stay late again. The manager pointed to a stack of cleaning supplies. "You think you can threaten me?" he growled. "You're going to clean every inch of this floor on your own time, or I'll make sure tomorrow's paycheck is even lighter." Ethan swallowed his fear. He'd half expected something like this. The real question was, would he stand there and take it, or would he fight back somehow? That was the dilemma pounding in his head as the store's doors were locked and the rest of the employees filed out. Grayson stood by the entrance, arms folded, watching Ethan like a predator. The stage was set for a confrontation, and something deep in Ethan's gut told him this was just the beginning of a storm that would either break him or bring him to a new level of courage he'd never imagined. Tass. That night, Ethan barely slept. He mulled over every possible course of action. He thought about how Grayson had robbed employees of wages, humiliated them, threatened their livelihoods. It dawned on him that this was a fight he could no longer avoid. The next day, he woke up with a plan swirling in his mind. If Grayson wanted to keep him late again, Ethan would be ready. More than that, he'd make sure to record every word the manager said, so there'd be no denying his cruelty. Lisa, Martin, and Jade had all agreed to do the same if given the chance. Their phones were armed with recording apps, and they were determined to gather enough evidence to make corporate, or even the labor authorities, take notice. The shift started quietly, almost too quietly. Grayson was nowhere to be seen at first, but Ethan felt the tension in the air. Around midday, the manager finally showed up, strutting through the aisles with a self-satisfied grin. He threw a glare in Ethan's direction, but said nothing. Instead, he focused on pestering Lisa, questioning her about why she wasn't smiling. "Enough, for customers. We're in the business of making people happy," he drawled loudly. "Maybe you should take a few lessons from our golden boy Ethan, who apparently has time to threaten me with corporate calls." Lisa avoided making eye contact, but she discreetly tapped the record button on her phone, which was tucked into her apron pocket. Ethan could see her hand trembling, but he admired her courage. Grayson continued his parade of insults throughout the day, but there was a sense of anticipation among the employees. They were like coiled springs, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in the late afternoon, when a major spill occurred near the front of the store. A display shelf had toppled over, sending cleaning products and glass bottles crashing to the floor. The mess was extensive. Broken glass, sticky fluids, and a pungent chemical odor that made customers recoil. Normally, this would be a job for multiple employees, each wearing safety gloves and carefully clearing debris. But Grayson saw an opportunity for humiliation. He called Ethan over in front of several customers and employees. With a loud, sneering voice, he said, "Get on your knees and start scrubbing, buddy. Let's see if you can handle something you're actually good at." The moment was humiliating. Some customers gasped or looked away. Others tried to pretend they hadn't heard. But the employees all froze, shooting Ethan sympathetic glances, while also feeling that electric buzz in the air. This might be it. Ethan's face burned, but he took a deep breath. He reached for gloves and a mop bucket, reminding himself that he needed tangible proof. As he knelt down to start cleaning, he felt his phone vibrate slightly. It was a text message from Lisa. "Recording! Hang in there." He mustered a weak smile, grateful that someone was capturing Grayson's verbal abuse. He had to keep the manager talking. Maybe if he could goad him into mentioning the missing pay, or threatening him again, that would seal the deal. So he replied with a pointed question, glancing up from the floor. Could you at least explain why I haven't been paid for those extra hours? He said loudly, so others could hear. Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. You haven't been paid because you're not worth it, he barked. How about you do what you're told and maybe next time I'll be feeling generous? A couple of customers exchanged shocked looks. One of them even pulled out a phone to start filming. Grayson noticed, but he was too lost in his arrogance to stop. That was the crack in the dam Ethan had been waiting for. With his heart pounding, he fired back calmly. It's illegal to withhold wages. You know that, right? Grayson let out a harsh laugh. You going to call the cops on me, big guy? He taunted. Good luck, it's your word against mine. Ethan's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to speak. Actually, it's not just my word, he said, voice shaking a little. Others are missing hours too. Grayson's eyes darted around the store, noticing that some customers and employees had their phones out. He let out a snarl, stepped forward, and loomed over Ethan. You think you can stage some sort of uprising? He spat. I'll have each and every one of you fired before this day is done. I know the district manager. I can make sure you never get hired anywhere else in this town. Ethan rose slowly, stepping out of the spilled liquid, mop in hand. He felt the adrenaline surge through him. He didn't back down. Instead, he stared Grayson in the eye and uttered words that made the manager's face twitch with rage. Go. Ahead, Ethan said. Make that threat again. Louder. For a tense second, everyone waited to see if Grayson would strike him. His hand twitched, but he held back, possibly aware of the cameras and phones capturing everything. Instead, he let out a dismissive snort. You're delusional. All of you are. Clean this mess up and get back to work, if you still want a paycheck tomorrow. With that, he stormed off, leaving Ethan trembling but strangely triumphant. He and the other employees exchanged glances. They had enough recorded threats and insults to take action. Ethan felt the shift in the atmosphere. People were no longer afraid to show their disdain for Grayson. Whispers circulated about sending the footage to corporate, about reaching out to the media, anything to expose the man for who he really was. Ethan finished cleaning up the spill, his knees sore, his pride bruised, but his resolve stronger than ever. As he disposed of the broken glass, Lisa slid up next to him, phone clutched in her hand. We got it, she whispered, eyes shining, with a mix of fear and excitement. We got everything on tape. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of hope. That night, he, Lisa, Martin, and a couple of other employees gathered at a nearby diner after their shift. Over lukewarm coffee and cheap fries, they played back the recordings, listened to Grayson's menacing tone, and watched the shaky phone footage of him mocking employees. The group decided this was the moment. They would report him to HR, and, if HR ignored them, they'd go further. They'd spread the clips online, contact local news, do whatever it took to end Grayson's reign of terror. Boom the boom the next day, tension crackled in the air like an oncoming storm. Ethan walked into the store feeling both anxious and empowered. He half expected to be fired on the Yijiaowai spot. But Grayson was curiously absent for most of the morning, which gave Ethan and the others time to finalize their plan. They agreed that if things got out of hand, they'd collectively walk out and present their case to corporate, all at once, refusing to return until Grayson was dealt with. It was a bold strategy, and they knew it might cost them their jobs. But the emotional toll of continuing under Grayson's tyranny had become unbearable. Around noon, Grayson finally showed up. But he wasn't alone. A suited figure accompanied him, a visiting corporate representative named Ms. Howard. Apparently, she was in town for a routine check, or so the company had informed the store. The timing was either a crazy coincidence or fate stepping in to tip the scales. Ethan and Lisa exchanged glances. Maybe, just maybe, they could seize this opportunity. Ms. Howard walked the aisles with a clipboard, occasionally stopping to speak with employees. Grayson hovered nearby, flashing his fake corporate grin and extolling how efficiently he ran the store. Ethan's stomach churned at the hypocrisy, but he kept his calm. Before Ms. Howard could finish her rounds, the store descended into chaos. A customer recognized Grayson from the viral phone video that one of the employees had quietly posted the night before. She approached him and said, "Aren't you the guy on that video screaming at your workers?" Her voice was loud enough to draw attention from nearby shoppers. Grayson's face went pale, then red. He stuttered, I don't know what you're talking about." But the woman pulled out her phone and played the clip for everyone to see. It clearly showed Grayson hurling insults at Ethan near that spilled aisle. Gasps erupted from onlookers. Miss Howard turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto the video playing on the customer's phone. "Is that you?" she asked Grayson, her tone icy. Grayson fumbled. "This is out of context. They're trying to set me up." Sensing an opening, Ethan stepped forward, heart hammering in his chest. "Ms. Howard, we have multiple recordings of him threatening to withhold pay, insulting employees, even bragging about tampering with timesheets." Grayson spun around, fury in his eyes. "Shut your mouth, Ethan," he roared, momentarily forgetting the corporate rep was right there. Ms. Howard's eyebrows shot up. She looked from Ethan to Grayson, then back. "Is that true?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded, pulling out his phone. "We can show you right now, if you'll let us. We have proof of missing wages, intimidation, everything." Grayson, sweating bullets, tried to laugh it off. "These punks are lying to cover their own incompetence," he said, but his voice quivered. The crowd of employees and a few curious customers was growing. Phones were out, capturing every moment. Ms. Howard took Ethan's phone, plugged in a small set of headphones, and watched the video in stunned silence. Next, she listened to the audio recordings. The color drained from her face. Without a word, she handed the phone back to Ethan, turned to Grayson, and said, "We need to speak, now." Grayson, red-faced, stammered, "Yes, of course," and tried to lead her to a private office. But Ms. Howard lifted her hand to stop him. "Right, here," she said firmly, glancing around at the employees. "We're doing this out in the open." That declaration sent a ripple of excitement through the staff. It was like the corporate rep was telling the manager he no longer deserved the courtesy of privacy. Customers backed away to give them space but continued to watch. Some even streamed the confrontation on social media. Grayson opened his mouth to protest, but Ms. Howard cut him off. "I've just seen multiple violations, including harassment, wage theft, and intimidation," she said in a clipped tone. "How do you respond?" Grayson's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. It's all a misunderstanding," he blurted out. "Those recordings are fake." Ms. Howard folded her arms. "Is that the best you can do? Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look good at all." Grayson's bravado was crumbling, and it was happening in front of half the staff and several customers with their cameras rolling. The tension reached a fever pitch. Ethan and Lisa exchanged a hopeful glance. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The public downfall of a manager who had tormented them for far too long. Grayson tried one last tactic. He grabbed Miss Howard's arm gently, leaning in to whisper something that only she could hear. But Miss Howard immediately pulled back, her eyes flashing with indignation. "You think you can bribe me or intimidate me?" she snapped. "I've seen enough." She turned to face the entire store, addressing everyone at once. Effective immediately, Grayson is placed on indefinite suspension pending a formal investigation. Anyone who has been affected by his behavior, please gather any evidence you have and forward it to my office. A stunned hush fell over the room. Then a wave of shocked relief rippled through the employees. Some started clapping. A few cheered. Grayson stood there, slack-jawed, as Miss Howard demanded his store keys and escorted him to the security desk, near the exit. As if the universe had a flair for drama, security guards had just arrived for their routine patrol. Miss Howard instructed them to keep Grayson off the premises until further notice. He tried to argue, but they guided him gently yet firmly toward the door. "This isn't fair," Grayson shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to me. I've built this store from the ground up." But no one paid attention to his outburst. Employees, customers, even the guards seemed done with him. Ethan watched Grayson leave with a mix of vindication and disbelief. He could hardly believe the man was being escorted out like a common criminal. Part of him wanted to gloat, but he chose to remain silent, letting the wave of justice wash over him. It felt surreal. He spotted Lisa wiping away tears of relief, Martin clapping quietly, and Jade watching with her mouth open in stunned awe. Their oppressor had finally been toppled, all because they had come together, stood their ground, and refused to be victims any longer. In the aftermath of Grayson's public suspension, a hush seemed to fall over the store. It was like the collective exhale of exhausted employees who had been holding their breath for far too long. Ms. Howard spent the next hour or so gathering statements, collecting phone, recordings, screenshots of timesheet discrepancies, and personal accounts of verbal abuse. She made it clear that corporate would investigate thoroughly. And if even half of what they provided was true, Grayson would be fired, possibly even face legal consequences. Once Ms. Howard left, the rest of the employees stood around in disbelief. Some were clearly still on edge, worried there might be retaliation, but most felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Lisa brushed a strand of hair from her face, tears still glistening in her eyes. "I can't believe we did it," she whispered. Ethan put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We did, and we're not going to hide anymore." Martin chimed in. "I didn't think I'd live to see the day that jerk got what he deserved." A few of them laughed, the kind of laugh that happens when months of tension suddenly melt away. Customers who had witnessed the confrontation lingered, some of them offering words of support. One elderly woman commented, "I saw the whole thing. That man should never be allowed to manage people again." Others came up to Ethan and Lisa, asking if they were okay, praising them for standing up to such blatant abuse. It felt surreal, almost like stepping onto a film set where the heroes triumphed at the climax. Except this was real life, and there were no guaranteed happy endings just yet. Still, seeing Grayson marched out was a victory, and it felt huge. Over the next few days, corporate sent a temporary replacement manager, a soft-spoken but efficient woman named Carmen. She made it clear she was there to keep the store running smoothly and to offer support where needed. On her first day, she gathered everyone in the break room and simply asked, "How are you doing?" Really, it was the first time in a long while that anyone with any authority had genuinely cared about the employees' well-being. People hesitated at first, unsure if it was safe to speak freely, but Carmen's empathetic tone eventually coaxed some honest answers. Lisa mentioned the emotional scars left by Grayson's constant belittling. Martin talked about his fear of losing hours whenever he needed to care for his sick child. Jade, eyes downcast, admitted that she almost quit her plans for college because she felt so trapped by Grayson's manipulation. Carmen listened quietly, took notes, and promised that their concerns would be addressed. It was a refreshing change, but also a reminder of just how much damage Grayson had done. Ethan noticed a shift in the store's atmosphere almost immediately. Customers commented on how the employees seemed friendlier and more relaxed. Instead of trembling at the thought of encountering Grayson in every aisle, people were actually smiling, chatting casually while they worked. Productivity didn't suffer either. In fact, sales numbers remained steady, proving that employees didn't need a tyrant breathing down their necks to get work done. If anything, morale lifted, and with it came a sense of renewed energy. It was as if they had all been given permission to breathe again. Meanwhile, rumors flew about Grayson's fate. Some employees claimed he'd be fired for sure. Others said he might get transferred, though no one seemed to want him in their district. There was even talk of a pending lawsuit from employees who had systematically lost wages under his management. Ethan tried not to dwell too much on speculation. He was content knowing that, at the very least, Grayson was out of the store. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered what would happen if that man came slinking back with a vengeance. One afternoon, about a week after the suspension, Ethan got called into a meeting with Carmen and a corporate HR representative over a video chat. They wanted to thank him for his role in bringing the wage theft issue to light. There was talk of a possible settlement for unpaid hours, not just for him, but for anyone else Grayson had shorted. The HR rep hinted that Ethan could have a bright future with the company if he wanted it, perhaps a supervisory role given his apparent leadership under stress. Ethan listened politely, thinking about his life goals. He'd always wanted to pursue something outside of retail, maybe start his own small business or go back to school. The offer was tempting, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to remain in a place that held so many painful memories. After the meeting, he found Lisa in the break room, flipping through her phone. She looked up, gave him a questioning glance. He shrugged, relaying the gist of the conversation. Lisa pursed her lips. "You're not actually going to stay, are you?" she asked gently. Ethan sighed. "I haven't decided yet. It's a decent job, but I feel burned out. The only reason I stayed this long was because I needed the money." Lisa nodded. We all did. They shared a moment of silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For them, this store had been both a lifeline and a prison. Now that Grayson was gone, the gates felt open, but the path to the future still felt uncertain. A couple of days later, corporate officially fired Grayson after their internal investigation confirmed multiple violations. It turned out his wage theft extended beyond just a few hours here and there. He had systematically manipulated time cards, messing with clock-in and clock-out times, all to make himself look good for budget reports. On top of that, there were claims of sexual harassment from a few female employees, something that made everyone's stomach turn. The company, eager to avoid a public relations nightmare, offered restitution and back pay to everyone affected. Grayson, on the other hand, was left without a job, his reputation in tatters. News spread quickly among the staff, sparking a sense of closure. Jade practically shouted with joy when she heard, hugging Lisa in the aisle. Martin texted his wife the good news and then wiped tears from his eyes. It was over. The tyrant was gone, and the store had a chance to rebuild its culture. Yet Ethan felt a bittersweet pang. He was relieved, but also determined not to let his life be defined by this place. With the immediate crisis resolved, he found himself eager to pursue something new. Maybe he'd go back to community college or look for a different job where his efforts would be appreciated from the start. Grayson's downfall had ignited a spark in him, a realization that he deserved better than just surviving under a hostile boss. On his final day, Ethan looked around the store with mixed emotions. He had put in his 2-week notice, opting for a fresh start. As he gathered his things, Lisa approached, a sad smile on her face. "You sure this is goodbye?" she asked. He nodded. "I need to figure out what I really want." Working under Grayson made me see how important it is to stand up for myself and to follow a path that doesn't kill my spirit. Lisa gave him a warm hug, telling him to stay in touch. Martin joined, patting Ethan on the back and thanking him for having the courage to expose Grayson. Jade appeared with a small goodbye card, signed by several of the employees. It was a humble token, but it meant the world to Ethan. He blinked back tears, touched by the camaraderie they had forged through adversity. He left the store that day feeling lighter than he had in months, if not years. As he walked to the bus stop, a breeze ruffled his hair, and he felt the simple joy of freedom. He might not have all the answers yet, but he finally had options, and the knowledge that he was capable of fighting for what was right. Little did he know, a final run-in with Grayson lay just around the corner. A chance encounter that would reveal how dramatically the tables had turned. But a few weeks passed. Ethan had spent his newfound free time brushing up on job prospects and attending some local networking events. While he hadn't landed anything permanent yet, he felt optimistic. One crisp afternoon, he decided to revisit the area near the store to run an errand at the bank. As he walked down the sidewalk, he spotted a figure sitting hunched over near the entrance to a small diner. From a distance, he thought it might just be another stranger, but something about the posture seemed familiar. Drawing closer, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was Grayson, looking disheveled, holding a paper cup in his trembling hands. The once proud manager was slumped on a low stoop, eyes hollow, stubble covering his chin like he hadn't bothered to shave in days. He seemed to stare into nothingness. People hurried by, barely sparing a glance. For a moment, Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. Memories of humiliation, anger, and fear surged through him. Part of him wanted to walk away. Another part wanted to confront the man who had caused so much misery. But above all, he felt an unexpected pang of pity, as if sensing someone's gaze. Grayson looked up. His eyes widened for a split second, and he tried to avert his gaze, perhaps hoping Ethan wouldn't recognize him. But it was too late. They locked eyes. Grayson glanced at the paper cup in his hand, which contained only a few coins. The humiliation in his expression was as raw as the day he'd been publicly exposed in the store. He mumbled something under his breath, something that might have been, "Spare some change," or maybe just an incoherent plea. Ethan approached cautiously, mind racing. This was the man who had stolen his wages, threatened his livelihood, terrorized his friends. And here he was, fallen from whatever pedestal he believed he occupied, reduced to asking for charity from strangers. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned in Ethan's chest. He thought of the old saying about karma, how it comes around in unexpected ways. He wasn't necessarily happy to see Grayson suffer, but he couldn't deny a sense of closure. Slowly, Ethan reached into his wallet and pulled out a single dollar bill. He placed it in the paper cup. Grayson mumbled a muted, "Thanks," not even meeting Ethan's eyes. For a moment, Ethan considered saying something, maybe to remind him of the cruelty he had inflicted, or to deliver a grand speech about justice. But the words didn't come. He simply stood there, looking at the broken man in front of him. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked away. The air felt different after that encounter. Lighter, somehow, as though a final chapter had been written. Ethan didn't feel the need to dwell on Grayson's downfall any further. The man had reaped what he'd sown, and now he faced the consequences of his actions. As Ethan continued down the street, he inhaled the crisp air and exhaled, a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He thought of Lisa, Martin, Jade, and the others who had banded together. They had stood up for themselves in the face of oppression, and it had worked. Now, they could move forward, free from Grayson's shadow. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from a new job lead, something that could be a real opportunity. He smiled, realizing that he had a future full of possibilities, a future no longer defined by one arrogant manager. And in that moment, the memory of Grayson's mocking laughter felt distant and powerless. Yes, karma had struck hard, but it had also brought a sense of justice and closure. Ethan walked on, shoulders squared, head held high, ready to embrace whatever came next. The echo of Grayson's sneering voice faded like a bad dream at sunrise, replaced by the renewed conviction that no one had the right to treat another human being the way Grayson had. And that realization alone was worth every moment of the struggle.